Hello, everyone. Great to be with you this evening. I'm coming to you live from Lakewood, Colorado, in my home. My name's Jeff Runyan. I'm the Director of Focus Missions. And welcome to Encounter and Share. This is Focus's guided journey through Lent. And you may have been joining for some of the previous sessions, or this might be your first time, but welcome. It's going to be hopefully kind of a casual chat with you all. And of course, it's all oriented around Lent. So when you think of Lent, if you grew up Catholic or have had any engagement with what we look at in Lent, there are three pillars that are always really highlighted, and that's prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. So the whole idea is that we re-examine our relationship with God, and we have a reversion and prepare ourselves and our hearts for the upcoming incredible celebration of the resurrection. So prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, again, all about that relationship with God. But today, I want to focus on almsgiving, and in a very particular way, talk about a component of that would be associated with what we call the corporal works of mercy. All right? And on the whole, I want to look at why and how the corporal works of mercy are so important to our relationship with God. And when you hear corporal works of mercy, association might come to mind of feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, all those type of things. But where did that all come from to begin with? I think if we look at Scripture, this is all these that have been identified by the church and by Jesus himself have come from the Gospels and in the way that God told us and instructed us to love and serve the poor. And if we think of the entirety of the Gospel, there's one chapter in Matthew 25 and some verses that are really the most concrete criteria that we have for salvation. And that's the one that says in Matthew chapter 25, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. A stranger and you welcomed me. Naked and you clothed me. Ill and you cared for me. In prison and you visited me." And when Jesus is talking about this, the people around him are confused. They're like, you're using a first person here. You're saying, "I was sick, I was hungry," and they say, "Jesus, when did we see you in these states and not do anything about it?" And Jesus says, in reply, "Whatever you did to the least of these, you did it to me." All right? And Mother Teresa actually used to sum up the gospel, or say that you could sum up the gospel in 5 words, and she did it with her fingers. She counted all 5 of those things, those words on her fingers, to say the sum of the gospel could be summed up as, "You did it to me." Whatever you did it to me. And so feeding the hungry again, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, visiting the sick, and we can add on to there some of the teaching of the church have identified things about visiting the imprisoned, burying the dead, and all these things that keep us in relationship with those who are poor and suffering. But these are things that are typically talked about during Lent. But I think there's another verse in Scripture, and when I think about all of these things, and another verse in Scripture that actually sheds even more light to how we are called to engage in these different corporal works of mercy. And that actually is earlier in the Gospel of Matthew. It's in Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. And this is, again, before Jesus actually used that term, "You did it to me." And this is what the scene looks like. So from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. "So when the Pharisees had heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, 'Teacher, which commandment of the law is greatest?' So Jesus says in reply, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And this is the greatest and first commandment.' And he says, 'The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself.' And he says something very important and very drastic here. He says, 'The whole of the law and the prophets depends on these 2 commandments.' So loving God with your whole heart, your whole mind, and your whole soul, and loving your neighbor as yourself." I mean, what does this mean? When God says, and Jesus says, the whole of the law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments, it's like if we get these wrong, actually nothing else matters. I mean, he literally says all the law and the prophets, and uses the term depends on loving God and loving neighbor. So hopefully this gets our attention. So why are these themes of loving God with our whole heart, our whole mind, and our whole soul so important, and how they relate to corporal works of mercy? And let's tease that out a little bit. So I think the point is, in the first piece of this, God is talking and Jesus is instructing us to love him in a very integrated way. And what does that look like? He's calling us to an integrated love of him that incorporates our heart, our mind, and our soul. Because if we just did love God with one of those components or another, it's actually not in the fullness of relationship that we'd want to be with him. And I think if we love God just with our heart only, I mean, that could be just a purely emotional love, right? And we'd be attached to those warm, fuzzy feelings that we get when we go to Mass. We get this retreat high. And those feelings are nice. They're good. They're gifts from God. But what's really dangerous with those is if we lose those feelings, our faith can just fall off as well. So that's why God's also calling us to love him with our mind too, and know that he's always there, and have that firm knowledge that he's always there. But if we love God uniquely with our mind, we might know things about God. We might know all kinds of facts, and you might be a great biblical scholar, but if you only know things about people, that doesn't mean you're in a relationship with God. And that's a really integral and an incredibly important thing to be, is in relationship with God. And finally, if we love God uniquely with our soul, it might look like we're just in mere compliance with God, kind of like we're in some kind of a arranged marriage with him, if you would. And you do everything right, but only maybe for the safety of your soul. You kind of go through the motions, but you never necessarily surrender your whole heart to God. So when these things are integrated, and we're loving him with all of these components that he's called us to love him with, our hearts burn with love for him. Our souls are prepared to meet him, and our minds are active in the pursuit of the truth, that knowledge of God. And that's the commandment. That's what loving God is. But let's take this on another level and particularly highlight the love of the neighbor piece of it, which is just as important. And we have to recognize that loving our neighbor is actually a means to loving God. You could say it's a stepstone in the path of salvation, not only for ourselves, but for our neighbors as well. When we love our neighbor in the way that we're called to through the corporal works of mercy, we bring that hope, that distinctive testimony of Jesus Christ to them. But something happens deep within us that deeply affects our relationship with God. So I'm the director of Focus Missions, and we do a lot of missions in Mexico City, and we work with the Missionaries of Charity a whole lot. That's the order that Mother Teresa of Calcutta founded. And Mother Teresa, Saint Mother Teresa, again, just was completely dedicated to the poor, and her order works with the poorest of the poor. And they have an order of priests that we were working with. And I remember one of those priests highlighting to us that Jesus loves us through the sacraments, and he expresses his love through us, and every time we go to Mass and all the blessings that he gives us. But we can actually express our love for God and console the suffering Christ as we console and pour our hearts out to the poorest of the poor. That's our means of love back to God. And if you've ever worked with the poor, perhaps on mission, you'll just know that Jesus Christ is truly present there. I was on a mission in Bogota, Colombia, just 2 weeks ago, and we were working with people who were just living in the streets in dire poverty and addicted to drugs and tortured by drugs and just starving, and everything that could on the surface be wrong was completely wrong. But I'll tell you what, when we're working with those suffering people, our hearts were burning within us. And a friend of mine who also is working in Mexico City gave us just a nice insight to that. And he's a Catholic convert, and he started this organization down in Mexico called Hope of the Poor. His name's Craig Joring. So if you ever go down to Mexico City, you might get to meet this guy. But he said that when he works with the poor, he started to notice that the same feeling that he gets in adoration is what he starts to feel in his heart as he's encountering and loving the poor. So, back to Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and just to demonstrate one of my favorite stories that was told about Mother Teresa and about Christ's true presence in the poor as well was this volunteer. It was about this volunteer who went to Calcutta. And Calcutta is just one of the most difficult environments that you could ever work in. There's just there's so many people who are just living in desperate, dire poverty and dying on the streets all over. It's almost like a war zone at times. And when you go to serve there, that's what it almost feels like. And your senses are on overload and everything's in the extremes. But there's a volunteer who is having a real hard time actually, getting into the nitty gritty of this and working with the people who are actually in squalor and maybe dying. And Mother Teresa decided to coach him that day and take him out to the streets. Now, I think that's a pretty good coach to have, this saint actually walking with you on the streets. And she tells this volunteer, she says, "Hey, you see that guy lying over in the streets? We're going to take him to my home, Calcutta, because he's on his deathbed, and you need to get him. And I'm too small maybe to carry him, but we need you to pick him up." And if you could imagine just the disgust that was in this guy's mind, and this going through his mind, it smells so bad, and he's covered with sores, and he didn't know what kind of diseases this guy might have or whatever. And Mother Teresa, again, if she suggested something to me, I hope I would do it. So Mother Teresa says, "You see that guy over there? Yeah, you're going to pick him up, and we've got to get a cab, and you're going to hold him on your lap." So you can imagine he's closer to this guy than he ever wanted to be, and he holds him on his lap, and he's just disgusted. He's trying to hold his nose and avoid getting sick, and he's in this hot taxi cab forever, and they get to Calcutta, and then the thing he really didn't want to do, Mother Teresa said, "Take him inside. Now take his clothes off and start to bathe him." And I mean, this is the utter most disgusting thing that this guy could ever think of. And so he's just barely peeling off all this horrible stuff that is going on with this guy, and the layers of woundedness and filth, and going through that and trying to bathe him. And the story goes that the volunteers that were there actually physically saw this guy shudder. And he looked at this poor guy, and he started just scrubbing and pouring his whole heart and just gently and beautifully loving this person and taking care of him. And Mother Teresa looked at him and said, "You saw him, didn't you?" I think for me, of course, she's saying you saw Jesus Christ. He had a glimpse of Jesus Christ, and I have no doubt that this guy's heart burned within him. But it's another demonstration of how God is truly present in the poor. So we talked a little bit about loving God with our whole mind, heart, and soul, and that integrated love. But that's also applicable to loving our neighbor as well. With Jesus Christ present in the poor, if we love the poor just with our heart, on one hand, we might just be loving out of pure emotion, maybe to make ourselves feel better, or ourselves feel good even. And that's not how we would love Jesus Christ ourselves. We would love Jesus Christ for the sake of him being God and him present in the poor. If we love the poor just with our mind and carry out this corporal works of mercy, we'd know maybe of the physical needs and of issues that people have, but we might be just tempted to throw money at problems and poverty. And imagine a missionary visiting a region plagued with starvation and simply dropping off a pallet of food and then leaving. We might have loved them with our minds in a certain sense, but we're absolutely ignoring them with their whole heart and soul, and actually taking care of them and loving them in the way that Jesus Christ had modeled to love them in an integrated way. So here's the thing. We're called to be in relationship with God, as those commandments have stated, and that beautiful reading from Matthew 22, of loving God with our whole heart, mind, and soul, being in relationship with God. But as God is truly present in the poor, we're actually called to be in relationship with the poor. It's not just an issue of executing these corporal works of mercy. It's doing so in the fully integrated way, doing it with our heart, mind, and soul. And so practically this Lent, when we live out these corporal works of mercy, let's keep this in mind. Let's proactively feed the hungry. Go out and find those opportunities and give drink to the thirsty and clothe the naked and shelter the homeless. But brothers and sisters, let's do it in that relationship, recognizing the dignity that they have. And practically, what does that look like? When you encounter someone who's suffering from poverty, it's not just, giving them some food. Maybe it's just eating with them, to actually taking them to a restaurant and hearing their life story and asking them, just showing them the dignity and love that God has for them. That's being in relationship with someone. That's loving the poor and carrying out those corporal works of mercy in an integrated way, and when we do that, when we relate to people and feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, and do this, this is how we are in right relationship with God and carrying out those corporal works of mercy in the right way. So if this Lent you actually take some action and take some steps towards living out this integrated love of God and being in relationship with poor, I just guarantee you that your hearts are going to be set afire in a new way. You're going to find yourself more prepared for Easter than you've ever been in your whole life. Your heart's just going to be on fire for Him in a new way, and you're going to be able to just live out that full joy of Easter and just really execute that which is the purpose of Lent, of just building in your relationship with God. And so thanks for joining us this evening. It's just a brief reflection. We're going to answer some questions, and we have a couple questions that have come through. So first question says, I want to volunteer with my city shelters, but I'm nervous doing it alone without my friends. Any advice? This is something that is pretty important to consider, and I think there's obviously a practicality to it. You want to, I think doing it with your friends is always great, and if you invite your friends along, that's actually a great opportunity to facilitate an encounter with Christ for them. There's a great desire that we have in our societies for volunteerism. So, hey, maybe you can actually be safe and actually, be very prudent to go love and serve the poor, but it actually provides you maybe a good opportunity to do some evangelization as well. So, I think that is a great question. It does come up a lot, but do consider inviting your friends along and looking at it through the lens of maybe being an evangelization endeavor. So. Next question we have is, what are the ways I can practice the works of mercy on a personal level, right? And I think this is a fantastic question because when we look at this, and we can state all of these things and just spout off like the rules and look at them as rules, but I think the number one thing is to be proactive in seeking out opportunities. It's a very difficult thing in the society in which we live to make sure that we're doing these things because we live in so much comfort. We don't necessarily every day see people in dire suffering, but there is people who are in dire straits and suffering all around us. And maybe God is calling you in a very drastic way also to go to the ends of the earth with the great means that we have to actually go and serve abroad. But you could do that practically by going on a focused mission trip. We try to facilitate these options for you. But during this Lent, if that's not in something that you signed up for or applied for as of yet, do go figure out what Catholic Charities is doing in your home community. What are the homeless shelters, and even just identifying people proactively on the street that if with your friends, and just say, hey, you know what, maybe we should go encounter this person. If they're flying a sign and begging, ask them their names and start a conversation. At a minimum, just having a conversation and acknowledging who they are can be very fruitful. So, again, it takes being a little bit proactive, and that's just like our prayer life. It does take being proactive. So, another question. Do I need all the corporal works of mercy? I don't feel comfortable visiting prisoners. Well, I would say that it's very important that we have an awareness of maybe how to do some of these things, but all of us might have distinct callings. And one of the things that when I think of visiting the imprisoned, that can take on a different species. Like, some people who are in nursing homes are in a certain sense imprisoned, and people could certainly feel imprisoned if they're in those situations. And if you go and to a nursing home, it's not necessarily a very threatening environment, but I think it is a way that we could maybe live that out in a distinct way that God might call us to. So, so on the whole, I do think it's important that we address all of these in some way, but it might take a variety of actually manifestations. And again, it is layered with that level of prudence that we were talking about earlier. So, Now, how do I know if I'm called to go on a mission trip? All right, that's a great question. And I would say, yeah, if God puts it on your heart, I think you should examine it. And I have a hard time saying that not everyone is called to go on a mission trip. I think everyone actually is called to go on a mission trip because it is something that deeply facilitates that encounter with Christ and the poor, that gets us out of our comfort zone and actually allows us to live out these corporal works of mercy in a very dramatic and amazing way. So I think if God has laid it on your heart and you are even asking the question, I think that's something that you should actually take action on. And that's how God works oftentimes, just putting a little idea in our mind and a little calling on our heart. And he's just waiting for us to say yes. So we have a lot of opportunities for missions that you can go on. You could check us out at focusmissions.org. And yeah, we'd love to have you on any trip in the future. So another question, what are ways I can help the poor without going to homeless shelters? Do churches offer projects like food banks, etc.? So I think that is a great option. Definitely there's food banks that you can go volunteer at and work at, and I think those are very important. But I do want to also emphasize, again, that importance of being in relationship with the poor. There's that supply lines that is very important, but, it's you want to be in relationship with God himself and have a conversation with Jesus. Like that's what we're called to do in prayer. And if there's some analogous themes to that, you'd want to be in relationship with the poor in some way. So I think it's important to go to some of these supply line things and work at food banks. But the more that we can have direct interaction, the better it is. There's often maybe a fear that comes with that, but I think if we can actually go and have those interactions, that's one of the big pieces that we have to do is just alleviate that fear. And we have so much to learn from the poor, oftentimes when we talk about the poor, I don't want to. I think it's important to say actually maybe those who suffer from poverty versus just labeling them as their state of life of the poor, but. In that state of life, there's a greater dependency on God typically than many of us have because of the comfort and luxury that we live in. So we learn so much by viewing just the faith and this utter dependence on providence. And so that's something that to really consider when we talk about carrying out these corporal works. All right, next question we have. The corporal works seem major. Would I be able to do these on mission trips? And how do I do these at home? So I think we've covered this fairly well. You'd absolutely be able to do these on mission trips. This is what we do. We facilitate opportunities to live these out. But again, how do we do these at home? There's all kinds of opportunities that we'd have to seek out, and be it at a homeless shelter or through a parish, or just look around. There's a lot of great Christian and Catholic services that are working for the poor, but it does take that being proactive to kind of search it out. So. I think we are done with questions, and it's been really great having the opportunity to share a little bit of reflection on these themes with you this evening. And I just want to highlight that we have more sessions coming up of Encounter and Share, this Lenten journey with Focus. And up next, we're going to have Jen Fulweiler speaking. That's next Sunday. And then the following speaker, we're all very familiar with, Father Mike Schmitz is going to be delivering a session. So look forward to continuing to maybe be engaged with you guys, and if we get a chance to be on mission together, it'd be fantastic. So have a very blessed Lent, and it's great to be with you. God bless.